There is something that I want you to know today. Something that you need to realize as a Christian when it comes to God's direction and guidance for your life personally. That the Bible declares that nothing can stop the plans that God has for you coming to pass. No person, no problem, no difficult situation, no matter what it is that you are going through or dealing with, that nothing can stop God's plan from coming to pass. That's why Isaiah chapter 14 verse 27 declares, "Who can change God's plans? When his hand is raised, who can stop him?" The obvious rhetorical answer to that question is no one and nothing. Now, Pharaoh in our story today, he didn't realize that little truth that's found in God's word. He didn't understand that you can't stop God's hand when God's hand is moving. He was trying to hinder the plans that God had for his people from coming to pass. Now, I just want to say as a side note, that's never the side that you want to be on. You never want to be on the side where you are standing against what God is wanting to do. Whether that's in your marriage, in your family, in your ministry, in your church, wherever it is that God has you, even in your own life as a single person, no matter where you're at in your life, you never want to be on the side where you're standing against what God is wanting to do. Pharaoh did that. He made that big mistake. But we will see that the power of Pharaoh or any person is never enough to stop the plans of God. The power of any person is never enough to stop the plans of God. And in our text today in Exodus chapter 8, we see Pharaoh start to realize this. So Pharaoh does what our enemy always does when he knows he can't win. He gives us the call to compromise. Now, if you are new to Regenerate or new to this story, I want to give you a little bit of a previously on Regenerate Church. You know, when you watch a television show and they do that to recap the previous series or the previous episode, they go previously on. So here's the previously what's happening in Egypt with God's people. We saw that the people of Israel have been in brutal bondage in Egypt for centuries. So the people of Israel have been crying out to God. And God heard their cry, and God raised up a deliverer, Moses, to deliver the people of Israel out of Egypt. But Pharaoh hardens his heart against what God wants to do. Over and over and over again, God goes to Pharaoh through Moses and gives Pharaoh instruction, but Pharaoh hardens his heart, resists what God is speaking to him, and says the people of God cannot go into the wilderness to worship for 3 days. And so God raises his mighty and powerful hand to show Pharaoh that you don't have the power to stop what God is going to do. And if you stand in God's way, you're going to be on the wrong side, and it's going to bring serious consequences. It's going to end up costing Pharaoh his own life. It cost Pharaoh the life of his oldest son. It costs the lives of many as they go through this horrendous time in Egypt, which is because of a hardened heart of their ruler. Now, Acts chapter 26, verse 17, when Paul recounts when he was living his life in rebellion to God and persecuting Christians, when God knocked him off what I like to say his high horse and called him on that road to Damascus, there in Acts 26:17, it says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads." Now, this is what God would often say to anyone who is standing against what God is doing. It's painful, it's hard to kick against the goads. You might say, well, what does that even mean? Well, the goad was a sharp, pointy stick that would be behind the ox, when the ox would be hitched to the wagon, oftentimes if the ox wanted to resist the leading of its master, whether it was plowing a field or pulling a cart, the natural tendency for an ox would be to buck and to kick the cart, oftentimes breaking everything that was just attached to it. And so the farmers got wise, and they built this ox goad that would be a sharp, pointy prod that when they would start to go to kick, they would jab their leg into this sharp stick, and they would learn, that's stupid of me to do. So they wouldn't do it anymore as a way to curve them. And what God is saying to Paul, listen, you are resisting the leading of your master. You are resisting what God wants to do in your life, and it's difficult, it's painful for you to resist it. That's where Pharaoh is at personally. He's resisting what God is doing. He's resisting the leading of God for his people. And when you resist God's divine direction for your life, it's always going to cause problems. You can fight God's plan, or you can flow with God's plan. But God's plan is still going to happen. And so we saw God turn the Nile River into blood. The Nile River was the source of sustenance for the people of Egypt. It was the way for them to have water in this desert region. Now they have no water for 7 days. 7 days goes by, and Pharaoh has a brief moment of a softened heart, but then he hardens his heart once again. And so God brings the plague of frogs. And we saw that last week, where apparently when Moses asked Pharaoh, how much longer do you want to be with the frogs? Pharaoh said, well, take them away tomorrow. Because I guess Pharaoh wanted to spend one more night with the frogs. And we saw last week, not one more moment with the frogs that illustrate sin. And that's where we pick up today in our text in Exodus 8, chapter 8, verse 10. It says this: when Pharaoh said, do it tomorrow, Moses replied, all right, it will be as you have said. And then you will know that there is no one like the Lord our God. Verse 11, the frogs will leave you and your houses, your officials and your people. They will remain only in the Nile River. And so Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's palace, and Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he had inflicted on Pharaoh. And the Lord did just what Moses had predicted. The frogs in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields all died. The Egyptians piled them into great heaps. Shows how many frogs there were. And a terrible stench filled the land. Now the frogs, which represent what we have in our world today, which is the plague of sin, it's dealt with. Pharaoh asked Moses to pray to God for him, and you could say that Pharaoh was prayed over, Egypt was prayed over, and now Egypt is delivered from this plague of sin. But then as they would pile up all of these frogs into these great heaps, well, the smell of the dying, decaying bodies of these frogs began to reek. And all of Egypt had this stench of decaying flesh. I point that out because you need to realize sin stinks. Oftentimes, we don't realize the stench that sin leaves, because the sin doesn't just affect us, it permeates every area of our lives. We think we can compartmentalize our sin. You know, if I sin in this area, that's going to affect this area of my life, but it never is contained to one area of our life. It permeates every area of our life. I remember when Morgan and I were newly married 12 years ago. Can't believe it's been that long already. Time flies when you're having fun. And Morgan and I, we got into our first little apartment. It was like 100 square feet. I'm pretty sure they rented it as an apartment, but it was truly just a closet. And within this closet that we lived in, we had one closet, singular, just one. And we put everything that we had in our lives in this closet. And a few months later, we realized that there was a stench coming from this closet. It was really starting to stink, so we used some Febreze, and sprayed it in there. Thought it just needed to be freshened up, but before long, it was even so much stronger than any Febreze and it started to really, really stink. We had some scented candles stored in that closet, and even the scented candles began to reek of this disgusting stench. We would take our clean towels out or our clean bed sheets out of our linen cabinet, and those would even reek of the smell. And everything was affected by this smell. We couldn't figure out what it was. We took everything out, and everything seemed to be clean and clear. But what I didn't know is that before we moved into this location, there was a problem with roof rats. And so the previous owner or renter had put a roof rat trap in the attic right above that closet. You can know where I'm going with this. Now, roof rat traps, they look a lot like a bear trap. It's just like a big claw. And what I didn't know is that above that closet in the attic, there was a roof rat, a giant roof rat, caught in this roof rat trap. Now, this rat trap caught this, I'm talking possum-sized rat. No, I'm talking like medium-sized dog rat. I mean, it was huge. And so when my landlord came and went into the attic, he pulled this trap down, and it saw the decaying, disgusting, half-dissolved body with the skeleton coming out rat, and its stench from it. Isn't that gross? I'm purposefully being that way because you have to understand, as it would permeate the smell of everything, I had to put my head on a pillowcase that smelled like that. Because like that dead rat, sin in the same way permeates everything. And I'm purposely being a little grotesque to make you be like, I don't know if I'm going to come back next week. Because I want you to understand that sin stinks worse than that. Sin stinks. And sin permeates every area and affects everything in our lives. We have to realize that sin can't be contained or compartmentalized to one area. And it affects everything. And did you know that scientists have actually discovered that smell triggers our memory more than any of the other senses? That's the whole idea with perfumes and colognes, it brings memories. A scent can bring a memory back that you had long forgotten. It's the strongest pull. And I think it's important to realize, as it would be for these people in Egypt, to remember how badly their sin, the frogs, stink. Now we're going to see the people of Israel be delivered from Egypt. Spoiler alert if you didn't know the end of the story. No one can stop God's hand. And they were in a place, Egypt, as they are currently in our story, where they're being beaten while they're baking bricks under the blistering sun by their brutal taskmasters. And they're crying out to God because of the great persecution. God, deliver us, God, deliver us, God, deliver us. And so God finally answers their prayer. And now God is doing these 10 plagues to show the power of God, that nobody can stop God's hand. And God is going to do what God promised he was going to do. And he's going to bring his people out of bondage. But do you know it's not before long we're going to see in the weeks to come that when the people of God are in the wilderness, they begin complaining because they don't have meat to eat, they don't have food, they don't have, the water doesn't taste very good, it was tap water, and it tastes like chlorine, not really, but it was bitter. And so they start complaining, and you know what they start doing? They start saying this: remember how good it was back in Egypt? We should just go back to Egypt. Back to what? Egypt is a type of the world where they were in bondage. And now God's people who have been delivered out of the bondage of the world are saying, oh, remember how good it was back in the world, back in Egypt? Oh, those were the good old days. And we think, man, they're so stupid and blinded and fooled. It was not good for them back there. They were beaten, persecuted, brutal times, but how quickly they forgot because they didn't remember the stench of sin. And you say, that's ridiculous. How could they forget that? But we do the same. We were in bondage in Egypt. Egypt, the type of the world, in bondage to the world, the things of the world. But then God hears our prayer, our cry, Lord, free me, Lord, deliver me, Lord, save me. And the Lord sends a deliverer, Jesus Christ, to come to deliver us out of the world. But what do? Well, we think about our past like it's the good old days. Oh, yeah, I remember those were the days. Oh, yeah, when I was young, we were doing all this, and all those were the good old days, my buddies and I, and it was good old days. No, you idiot. Wrong. How quickly have you forgotten the stench of sin? How quickly we forget the pain and problems that come from sin. I think it's important that we never forget that sin stinks. And that when we get a whiff of sin, if you will, we remember it brings back those memories, that it would jog our memory to say, I never want to go back to that. Don't forget where you were and what the things were really like when you were in the world. Because when you remember who you were, you're going to be so much more thankful for who you are now in Jesus Christ. Sin stinks. But I love how the Bible declares that Jesus can wash us and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. Guess what? Our sheets got clean again. We maybe threw some out, but you know what? Our sheets were clean again one day. They didn't smell like dead rat anymore. Why? Because that was dealt with. It was taken away. God cleanses our hearts in the same way. He removes the skeletons from our closet. And God can wash us and cleanse us of all unrighteousness so that we're free to live the life that he's called us to live. Then it goes on to say in verse 15 of chapter 8, but when Pharaoh saw that relief had come, he became stubborn. He refused to listen to Moses and Aaron just as the Lord had predicted. Now, what Pharaoh does can be a real tendency in our own lives personally. Because when times are difficult or things are not going well, we often, like Pharaoh did, realize, I need God. Pharaoh says, pray for me. We need help. And what do when we go through difficulty? We pray more, we read our Bibles more, we call out to God. When we are in a situation that's so beyond us, we know that we need God's help, and then God answers our prayers. God comes through miraculously, supernaturally, delivers us, helps us, and then when we go through difficulty, we're usually taking the opportunity to seek God in a greater way. But like Pharaoh, the Lord answers our prayers. And when things get better for a while, and we can so quickly and easily slip into what I call spiritual lethargy, apathy in our walk with God, not seeing our real need for Jesus every single day. I wonder what our lives would be like if we sought Jesus as much when things are going good as much as we do when things are going bad. I wonder what our lives would like if we realized every single day, I need God more now, right now. And even when things are going good, maybe we would realize things are only going good because we were seeking God like we've never done before when things were going really bad. And I wonder if we could be someone that would realize, like that old hymn says, Lord, I need you. Oh, Lord, I need you. Every hour I need you. And when we realize our need for that, maybe we wouldn't fall into what Pharaoh did, because the Lord answers his prayer. The frogs are dealt with, and then Pharaoh, things get a little bit better for a couple hours. And then Pharaoh realizes relief had come. Relief came through Jesus, through God. But because of the relief, he became stubborn again and refused to listen, just as God predicted. And then it says in verse 16, so the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, raise your staff and strike the ground. The dust will turn into swarms of gnats through the land of Egypt. Now, Moses is told by God to take his staff, that staff that God would use to bring about the 10 plagues, that staff that God will use to part the Red Sea, that staff that God will use to give them victory over the battle of the Amalekites, that staff. You have to realize that staff. When Moses was making all those excuses in the beginning of the book of Exodus, why he couldn't be used by God, I can't because I can't speak well, and he gave a plethora of excuses. Do you remember the story? And as Moses is giving all these excuses, God finally says, Moses, what is that in your hand? And Moses says, it's my staff, a walking stick. And God says, then I will use that. It's a picture to us that God will use whatever we have as long as whatever we have is for God. And now God is using that staff again to bring about the next plague. This plague, it's a plague of gnats. Or is it? Because the word for gnats in the Hebrew language, which that is what the Old Testament, the book that we're reading currently, is written in, it's the word Cain, which that word can be translated gnats, but it can also be translated lice, or it can also be translated maggots. So which one is it, Pastor Brenen? Most likely it's probably all of the above. It was probably an insect swarm, an infestation of different types of insects crawling from the ground as Moses would drag his staff across the ground. All the dust in this desert region, all the sand of this desert region turned into crawling insects, maggots and lice and gnats infesting everything. The psalmist gives us a little bit of an insight in Psalms 105, verse 29. It says, he turned their waters into blood and killed their fish. Their land abounded with frogs, even in the chambers of the king. That means even in Pharaoh's bed. Verse 31, he spoke, and there came swarms of flies and lice, differentiating between the two. The next plague we'll see is the flies and lice in all their territory. And so now, Pharaoh didn't respond to the plague of the blood river. He didn't respond to the plague of frogs. So now the next plague is a plague of insect swarms, lice infesting everything, maggots, gnats. It's disgusting. I remember Morgan and I a little while back, in our family room, we were sitting on the couch and we saw this little thing kind of crawling, looked like a baby little inchworm, but upon closer inspection, we realized it was a maggot. And we're like, what in the world is a maggot doing on our couch? And so we killed that and we sat there for a little bit longer, and then another one started crawling. Where in the world? So we started pulling everything apart and come to find out on the back of our couch, between the wall and our couch, one single carpet beetle got into our house. How many of you have ever heard of a carpet beetle? Yeah, don't worry, neither have I. And you know what? We end up bringing a guy to take care of this situation. And he came in, he's like, oh yeah, carpet beetles are really common. I'm like, that's funny. I've never heard of them. But what carpet beetles do is they eat fabric either from your carpet or from your couch. And then within the fabric, they lay eggs. And when the eggs hatch, all this larva begins to go everywhere inside your couch. Anybody feeling itchy yet? And so we had an infestation of larvae that end up hatching and growing into beetles. And then those carpet beetles turned into more beetles. It was disgusting. And so we had the house bombed. Like literally, it wasn't like a fumigation, and we just put a bomb, like an atom bomb in our house. We just, we're ending it. And so we did that, and we said, you know what, we're not going to keep this couch. This is so gross, And you might say, Brenen, why are you telling me this right now? Just so you'll never want to come over to my house anymore. No, I'm kidding. And so we took the couch and we put the couch out on the curb. We called the trash and we said, we have a special item pickup. We need you to just come and take this away, because we didn't even want the couch in our house. Although we had cleaned it up and had it professionally treated, it looked like a brand new couch. We just didn't even want to deal with it. So we put it out front. An hour later, I went back out front and someone stole the couch. They thought it was like, one of those free things they just come by and grab. I'm like, I feel really bad for whoever should take that couch and put it in their house thinking it's a brand. That's why you probably should never steal someone's couch off their front yard, because you never know what's inside of it. So we get it all treated in this larva. We had the carpet sprayed and everything, and finally we're all done with that situation. But I remember how gross and disgusting that was, just having the maggots around, because they would just kind of get everywhere. It's disgusting. Now Egypt is infested with not only with maggots and gnats, but most likely lice. And lice in Egypt was believed to be a curse from the gods that they worshiped. And that's why Egyptians of higher levels of authority or social status, pharaohs and those in his court, priests and others, would shave every aspect of their body. If you've ever seen any old Egyptian movies where their heads are all bicked and all of that, that's because they were so afraid of having the curse of lice, they kept every aspect of their body shaved because they didn't want lice. Now, every single person is plagued with lice and maggots and gnats, and they're realizing that they're cursed in this way. And so Moses, verse 17, and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded them. When Aaron raised his hand and struck the ground with his staff, gnats or lice infested the entire land, covering the Egyptians and their animals, which is another hint that it was most likely lice, because they were covering the animals and the people, and maybe gnats as well. And it infested everything. All the dust in the land of Egypt turned into gnats or lice. Pharaoh's magicians, now watch this. Remember the first couple plagues that God does? The magicians, the people, Janus and Jambres, they use demonic power to replicate, because this is what Satan always wants to do. Watch this, watch this. You might be wondering why every time God shows his power, these demonic guys replicate that. Because whenever God is doing something true and real and powerful, there will always be cheap counterfeits. There will always be fake replications. Why? Because it's meant by the enemy to diminish the power of God. Look, God's not that powerful. We can do the same thing. And if you don't believe me, then just go to the swap meet. Because if you realize wherever there's something real and true, there will always be cheap counterfeits. You can see those and find those at the swap meet. And so now these magicians, so-called, these demonic practicing in the occult, they tried to do the same thing with their secret arts, but this time they failed. And the gnats, the lice, they covered everyone, people and animals alike. So here's what they say: "This is the finger of God," the magicians exclaimed to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He wouldn't listen to them, just as the Lord had predicted. Now all the dust in this desert region turns to lice. And now the Egyptians are plagued with this. And now watch what they say. These demonic priests, their final words, and this is the last time we're going to see them in this story. It says, they say, "This is the finger of God." The finger of God, or the hand of God. This is God, the one true living God. This is God, his power. We can't even replicate it. Notice the finger of God. That phrase is used a couple of different places in the Bible. The finger of God is used a little bit later, a few chapters from now, when God will stretch out his finger and write the 10 commandments in the tablets of stone and give those to Moses. The finger of God also writes judgment upon the wall there of Belshazzar's palace in the story of Daniel. The finger of God will write judgment is impending. That same finger, the law, which points out our failures, the finger of God that says judgment is coming, the finger of God that's bringing these plagues, the finger of God. But listen, that same finger is recorded another place in the Bible, in John chapter 8, when Jesus stooped down and began to write with that same finger in the dust. But this time it was because a woman who was caught in the very act of adultery was pulled from the house where she was engaged in that act of adultery and thrown nakedly before Jesus' feet. And they said, "This woman was just caught in the act of adultery. What do we do with her?" The law says that we should stone her, and with stones in hand, they were wanting and ready to kill her. But if Jesus said, you got to obey the law, then Jesus wouldn't be a God of love. But if Jesus said, no, you have to disobey the law, let's just show our love, then God wouldn't really be honoring the law. So it was a trap for Jesus. So Jesus bends down and it says he wrote against what? Most likely he was writing against those who were standing there with rocks. Maybe their own secret sins. Most likely things that they have done, maybe places attached to names, dates, exact things. And it says that one by one, from oldest to youngest, because the oldest had more sins. They had more of a deeper past. They got out of there quicker. And they started dropping their rocks and they walked away until none of her accusers were there anymore. And Jesus speaks to this woman with love and compassion. He says, woman, where are your accusers? And she looks up and wipes the tears from her eyes, realizing everyone's gone. And she says, sir, I guess I have none. And then Jesus says these beautiful words back to her and says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Delivering her from that life of sin, because the finger of God only brings judgment for those who are living in disobedience to God. But the same finger that once brought judgment now brings forgiveness because it's through Jesus Christ. And so that finger of God, the hand of God we see, brings judgment to you or can bring salvation to you, but it's based upon the decision, will you receive what Jesus Christ has done for you? That hand of God will judge the world one day. But the finger of God is also offering forgiveness to you, because attached to those fingers was God's hand. And attached to God's hand was nails that would attach him to the cross, as he would be pinned there for your sins and my sins. And that same hand would be stretched out for you and for me. The hand of God. Then it goes on to say in verse 20, then the Lord told Moses, get up early in the morning and stand in Pharaoh's way as he goes down to the river. Say to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse, then I will send swarms of flies on you, your officials, your people, and all the houses. The Egyptian homes will be filled with flies, and the ground will be covered with them. But this time I will spare the region of Goshen, where my people live. No flies will be found there. Then you will know that I am the Lord, and that I am present even in the heart of your land. I will make a clear distinction between my people and your people. This miraculous sign will happen tomorrow. Now these flies that God would send in this fourth plague, these flies that are still in Egypt today, these are desert flies, not like our little house flies that are annoying. These flies, they bite, they hurt. And when they bite, they also plant eggs underneath the skin of people. And so these flies would be not just a nuisance to people, but a real health hazard to the Egyptians. And now they're realizing there's going to be swarms of flies driving them crazy. But now God says, this time, the first 3 times his people were affected, but now God makes a differentiation between the two. This time, it's only going to be brought against Egypt. Now, previously, God's people went through the difficulty like the Egyptians did. But now God's making a clear distinction. We talked about this before. There will be certain problems that you have in life just because you live in the world. There's certain problems that you have from being a part of the world. When sin entered the world, so did pain and so did problems. It's what we call life. And life is hard and life is difficult. But we also saw that God wastes nothing. And everything that God allows to happen in your life, God will use for his purpose. That nothing goes to waste and God will use everything. There's a purpose for that problem. But there are certain problems that we can avoid and be protected from that the world is still plagued by because we live in obedience to God. That's what we're told in the book of Corinthians when we're to be in the world but not of the world. We have problems because we're in the world, but when we start being of the world, that means doing what the world does. There's unnecessary problems in our lives that could have been avoided if we would have been obedient to God. Now, there's certain problems that plague the planet because we don't walk in wisdom and in God's instructions. And there should be a separation between God's people and the world. Our lifestyles, our habits, the places that we do, the things that we engage in. Remember when Joseph moved his family to Canaan, to Egypt, he did that so he could take care of them. But Joseph told his family to tell Pharaoh when they asked for their own land in Goshen, to tell him that you are shepherds. Why? Because shepherds were the outcasts of society. Shepherds were looked down upon. And if they went on record by saying we are shepherds, it would be a protection for them and a separation of them. A protection because they wouldn't be allowed to worship Egypt's pagan gods, so God would protect them that way. And it would be a separation of the people of Egypt, so their culture wouldn't be absorbed into Egypt. They would be separated from the ways of the world. In the same way, Jesus gives us that same instruction to be set apart, to be sanctified from the world. It would be a protection for us, a separation to us, that we be set apart, that we're not influenced by the ways of the world, because you will never regret ever doing what is right before God. Now, verse 24 says, and the Lord did just as he had said, a thick swarm of flies everywhere, so thick you probably couldn't even see through it. Thick swarm of flies filled Pharaoh's palace and the houses of his officials. The whole land of Egypt was thrown into chaos by the flies. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. All right, go ahead and offer sacrifices to your God, he said, but do it here in this land. Now notice this. Pharaoh tells Moses, I'm going to end here, but watch this. Pharaoh tells Moses, okay, fine, you can have your way. He realized he couldn't deal with the power of God. Even his demonic officials said this is the hand of God, the finger of God. Pharaoh realized there's nothing he could do to stop God. So when he realizes he can't be more powerful than God and stop God's plan, watch what he does. It's what our enemy does. He says, why don't you just worship God? You can have your 3 days off, but do it here. Stay here. Notice the convenience of compromise. God would call his people to the wilderness to worship at that very mount that God appeared to Moses in that burning bush. But now Pharaoh says, listen, it's inconvenient to go take everyone over there. It's going to be too difficult. Just worship from where you're at. Just stay here. You can worship God. Go ahead, worship God. But why do you have to travel? Why do you have to get in your car and go to the place? Why can't you just stay home and worship from home? Why do you have to travel to the place that God has established for you to do that? Do you have to go to the place that God has established you to go? It's easier for you just to stay home. Do it from here. It's hard to get everyone out the door. 3-day journey. You think traveling to church for 10 minutes is a long drive. 3 days to go worship the Lord. And they had to walk. It would have been tempting for Moses to compromise with Pharaoh, wouldn't it? Okay, fine, all right, fine. We're just happy to be able to worship God. And now that we can worship God freely, we'll just take what we can get. Moses doesn't compromise for convenience, though. God told Moses to go 3 days into the wilderness in Exodus 3, verse 18, and Moses would accept nothing less. And I love that. Moses would say, I'm going to do what God has called me to do. Never compromise for convenience. So many good believers have been brought down by the same strategy that Pharaoh used. You don't bring people to Christ by making compromises. If you go down to where they are at, why would they want to come up to where you are at? Stand your ground and have conviction. Don't compromise. Jesus said in John chapter 15, verse 14, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you to do. We need to do what he says as he says to do it. Moses wouldn't compromise. Here's the bottom line. If you want to be a Christian, then worship God. And don't compromise. If you don't want to be a Christian and you want to stay in Egypt, then that's your decision. But either go for it wholeheartedly or don't go at all. Make a decision and do it with your whole heart. Watch Moses' response as Pharaoh gives him, listen, just stay here. The convenience of compromise. Just worship God from where you're at. And watch Moses' response in verse 26. He says, but Moses replied, that wouldn't be right. The Egyptians detest the sacrifices that we offer to the Lord our God. Look, if we offer our sacrifices here where the Egyptians can see us, they will stone us. We must take a 3-day trip into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, just as he commanded us. All right, Pharaoh says, go ahead. I will let you go into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God, but don't go too far away. Now hurry and pray for me. Moses answered, as soon as I leave you, I will pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the swarms of flies will disappear from you and your officials and all your people. But I'm warning you, Pharaoh, don't lie to us again and refuse to let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. So Moses left Pharaoh's palace and pleaded with the Lord to remove all the flies. And the Lord did just as Moses asked and caused the swarms of flies to disappear from Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. Not a single fly remained, but Pharaoh again became stubborn and refused to let the people go. Moses says, listen, when Pharaoh offers this opportunity, just stay where you're at, worship from where you're at, Moses says, no way, Jose. We are not going to compromise. This is the key for successful Christian living. Not to see how close we can stay to Egypt. Pharaoh then says, okay, well then you can go worship God, but don't go too far from Egypt. Stay close. But the goal of the Christian life is never to see how close we can be to the world and still worship God. God was calling them to go away from Egypt, to separate from Egypt so they wouldn't be like Egypt and Egypt wouldn't taint them anymore. And the same message is true for our lives. Our lives are never meant to be, how can we have one foot in the world and one foot worshiping God? How can we be accepted in the world and accepted by God? That is never the place that we can live, because we'll always be torn in two different directions. The key to successful Christian living, dear friend, is to no longer have a foot in the world, but to be following God wholeheartedly. Leaving that stuff behind, not forgetting the stench of sin and how it permeates everything, and saying, you know what, I don't want to be around that stuff. That stuff stinks. I want to be wholeheartedly following after God, and I want to go where he's called me to go. And I want to do what he's called me to do. No longer going to compromise because it's convenient. And listen, I know it's easy. I know it's convenient, and all the technology and all the things that we have to worship God out of the comfortability of our own home and where it's convenient, all of those things. But listen, don't compromise because of convenience. The key for successful Christian living is to be wholeheartedly following the Lord, not how close we can stay to Egypt and still be good with God. Listen, nothing can stop the plan that God has for you. But when the enemy realizes that, he's going to try to get you to compromise so that you will never see God's plan from being fulfilled in your own life. Don't bite the bait. Don't compromise. Don't give in. But do exactly what God has said, and you'll see that God will come through and do what he said he will do. Never compromise for convenience.